It's the new app SpongeBob Moves In. You can build your very own bikini bottom, make your own Krabby Patties, play with your favorite characters.
Oh, this is gonna be good.
SpongeBob Moves In. Available for purchase on these devices.
SpongeBob Moves In was a mobile city-building game with a SpongeBob theme released in 2013 to generally mixed reviews, especially considering the fact it cost $2.49 at first, and little fanfare. In spite of this, as a child, I, and presumably many others, very much enjoyed the game and happily whiled away their time playing it. Throughout its life, and in spite of anything, the game was often updated with bonus seasonal content, decorations, storylines, quests, and even characters to keep the game fresh and interesting.
So you have to collect hearts, and then when you get enough, you unlock these, and then there's this one, where it's like a community one where everybody's score is added together and you unlock these 3.
Personally, I first played it back in summer 2013 and continue to do so on and off right up to early 2017, albeit that last stint was more out of nostalgia than anything else. Now, in the nicest way possible, SpongeBob Moves In was, how can I put this, not very well written in some ways, with constant crashes on startup in the early days, and the game taking up a whopping 2 GB in an era where 32 GB on your iPad was still a pipe dream for most people, before later admittedly being compressed down to around 500 megabytes.
But still, that's a lot, isn't it?
Especially for what it is and when it was. As well as other things like random glitched duplicate characters.
So 2 of both of those characters there. Him, I've only just ended up with 2 of him.
And entire data corruption, sometimes. You know, minor glitches. In spite of always being a computer nerd at heart, as much as kids these days rhetoric bullied me into thinking I was part of the non-existent problem to the point of trying to repress it somewhat, I would have been fascinated to look into the back end of how the app worked even back then. However, I was, of course, on iOS, which meant I could do absolutely nothing with said back end. And given that this was iOS 6 through 9, I could already barely do anything with the front end.
They're sickening.
At some point, I was sitting in my grandparents' living room using Pic Collage's online videos feature, which allowed you to add videos from YouTube into your collages. So I was sitting on their sofa and came upon a tutorial video for how to get unlimited money in the game, a process which involved using a file manager, specifically iFile, to navigate into the app's files and modify one of the files within. This footage you're seeing here isn't the exact video, but it was this method and this era of iOS and looked basically exactly like this. In spite of how cool jailbreaking sounded in general when I learned what it was a bit after this, I knew there was no chance of my parents letting me do it, and as such I never got to try this out myself. Oh yeah, and I didn't even get to try the built-in file manager because that inexplicably didn't exist on iOS until September 2017. I thought it was like 2015 or 16. Late 2017. How did it take that long? Fast forward to 2021 and I'm happily running Android on my phone and suddenly realise out of nowhere that I could almost definitely edit the game files in the same way as that video had said were I to install the app on this. So for the heck of it, I did it, and it worked. Like scratching a 10-year-old itch, I easily breezed through buying all the characters infuriatingly locked behind absurdly high prices and sped up every process that came my way. However, when I'd first opened the app, I'd been met with a truly harrowing sight. I didn't have much time. The game was going to be shut down, and sure enough, only almost a month late for some reason, the game was shut down. And this wasn't just a removed from the app stores but you can carry on playing if you have it situation, this was murder. Sure, the app connected to a server to store the main copy of your save, but it worked offline too. It had always had an offline mode. This was needless, brutal murder of what some people spent hard-earned real money on in entirely unreasonably large quantities. In fact, come to think of it, I had spent real hard-earned money on it. I never bought any microtransactions, sure, but I'm such an OG of this stupid little thing that I started playing when it still cost £2.50. And now, nothing. I let a metaphorical tear run down my cheek, accepted the loss, closed the app, and moved back on with life.
Can you believe how dramatic I'm being?
But I couldn't help but feel like that couldn't be it. Surely the game data is still here, it's just inaccessible. I don't see why the developers would go to the trouble of removing everything but this message in an update when they could just slap this message on the front, lock you out of the rest and call it a day. With this in mind, I tracked down an APK online, set the date on my phone back to 2020 because I couldn't off the top of my head remember when in 2021 it had died, disabled Wi-Fi and mobile data and installed it. Sure enough, it didn't give me the error. What it did do was crash. After a brief momentary glimpse of this screen. You see, the APK isn't all we need here, it's not that simple. The game downloaded a bunch of additional data on first startup, and obviously the server on which this data is stored is inaccessible with my networking turned off, and when I turned it back on, even with a slightly older version of the APK, the server data has clearly been entirely replaced with the code that gives you the error. The fact that I actually remembered that this extra cache download needed to happen is what put me off doing this for so long in the first place. A bit of cursory Ecosia-ing didn't seem to turn up any results, and I wasn't surprised. I didn't imagine anyone would have saved this. But then, I found this. This sketchy-ass Russian site hosting an unlimited money mod and claiming to host the cache data in the form of its OBB file.
I don't believe it!
To my surprise, the download worked and didn't just take me to a bunch of sponsored links, and instead of running this in a virtual machine like a sensible person, I slapped this straight onto my phone, disabled everything again, and fired up the app, which I promptly then had to uninstall and reinstall because it had somehow managed to self-destruct in the background. But sure enough, we're in! Would you look at that? Up and running, good as new. Now most people would call this a job well done and move on with their lives. But not me. No, not me.
Let's do this.
Now, during my research, I'd read on the cutting room floor, which stated that the app was no longer functional without modifications, while not telling you what the modifications necessary were, which could have saved me a couple minutes, or even allowed me to use this without having to turn off networking, but whatever. Anyway, on the cutting room floor, it said that there was a hidden developer mode in the game which could be accessed by editing the file global_settings.
Jason!
There was also reference to this image, which I had actually previously found within the APK, which is clearly of a whiteboard in the development studio planning out the layout of the map, and was also for some reason upside down in the file. Clearly not from the original development stage, because it has the boardwalk, which wasn't added until a later update, so I'm not sure exactly what they were aiming for with this, but given that they had already got it, it's fine. I don't claim to be a game developer, I've messed around in Unity a bit, and that's the extent of my knowledge. I could not get this dev menu to work. I tried editing it on my phone, in Notepad, even in a hex editor, but all it did was cause the game to hang on startup. I even tried to drop in replace the modified cache data file while the game was running, but no dice. And I couldn't find anyone else online talking about this to offer any kind of information, so...
Very well.
You may not be willing to give me unlimited items the clean way, SpongeBob Bob, but you can't stop me from hacking them in. I knew from that ancient video that as a result of the game being, as we discussed, not written very well, that the values for player currency were stored in plain text. My document has just automatically scrolled back to the top. I knew from the ancient video that as a result of the game being not written very well, the values for player currency were stored in plain text somewhere in the files. It didn't take long to narrow it down to game.
Jason!
And it didn't take long once in there to find the values, which I inexplicably remembered as being specifically under amount_earned. I don't know why I can remember so much junk like this, but not basic high school level maths, but there we are. At first, it didn't work. At first, I thought maybe the amount I had before had somehow stayed stored somewhere and added on to the value I'd put in, which was the maximum value the game could handle, which caused it to, like, overflow and revert back to the previous value. But changing the value to less didn't work either. At some point, I even somehow ended up with negative currency. I don't know how.
I've just got this big overdraft. I take it all back. There. Normal.
Then I realised it was just because I put commas in the values. How that caused the negative currency, I have no idea, but the main problem was that I put commas in the values. I'd only done that because it's how it was written on the cutting room floor, and I assumed that was showing verbatim what the value should be, but not to worry.
Money, money, money. Must be funny in the rich man's world.
I also tried to increase my level, but couldn't get that to work. Oh well. I soon figured out that this also worked with amounts of food as well, and even did actually manage to get the level up eventually when I realised there are two separate values you have to change for some reason. With all that out of the way, here we are. Not feeling up to any more technically unnecessary hacking, I manually cleared out all of the seaweed from the land expansions and then took to trying random stupid things that Unlimited Wealth lets you do, like tarmacking the lot, or as much as I could. There was a bit of overlapping seaweed in some places that meant I couldn't fill in all of the squares. Quite annoying. Oh well. Surely this is where I'd call it a day. Job well done, right?
No!
As I discussed earlier, back when the game was still in active development, there were fairly frequent seasonal events with themed decorations, costumes, and even characters, and playing it without any of that just feels bland. Back in the day I had all sorts going on, but something I first noticed when I gave it that other look in 2017 was that when all you have is the base game, you kind of feel a sense of completion without the feeling of satisfaction that usually comes with that sense. It's hard to explain, and it's probably just me. You've got everything that you can get, but because you know you missed out on so much more, you feel done, but kind of disappointed. Like, that's it. I'm done, I guess. Whatever. What didn't help was the fact that even when I did have some of the seasonal items, it always felt like I was getting the leftover sweepings off the floor. What I mean by that is, the first Christmas the game was out, you could get, among other things, a spice shack, a treat shop, milk and cookie cafe, and elf apartments, which gave you an elf character who would just live there perpetually. But by the time I started playing, the Christmas events only gave you the first two of those, which they then tied into the Plankton storyline when they added him to the base game, meaning that they then had to offer those buildings to all players all year round anyway, making them lose any remaining sense of exclusivity. Then just as one final unwelcome kick in the teeth, when I came back to the game in 2017, long after I was sure they'd stopped adding new content, it turned out I'd missed even more seasonal stuff. At that point I think I even sent a support message in suggesting they had the option to replay seasonal events even if behind a paywall or something. I think after that they did give you the option to buy some of the previous limited items and characters, albeit at often extortionate prices, but I wasn't playing it all by then and it's felt like a bit half-hearted. But anyway, with my ever-expanding knowledge of how the back end of this game worked, it was once again time to do it myself. Let's get into the weeds. All of the actual game data is housed in the OBB file, the cache data we got from the Russian site, and if we pull it up in a hex editor and search for Christmas, we can find that, sure enough, the seasonal items are in fact here, which makes sense given that even though you can't obtain them anymore, if you previously had them in your town, they still need to be there. So logically, all I should have to do is add some kind of reference to them from here into game.json.
Well, how hard can it be?
Don't say that!
Taking a closer look at game.json, I narrowed down that the first chunk of data is all of the items in your town, buildings, decorations, characters, etc., and that when an item is in your inventory, its corresponding coordinate values are set to null. Clearly, these two values refer to the item itself. The format of the DID value here is the same as the DID value alongside the building name in the OBB file. What about this GUID string? It doesn't seem to be listed anywhere around the entry for a given item in the OBB, and none of these other values match the format of the GUID strings from game.json. Eventually I figured out that by selecting the building name in the OBB file, the GUID field, which I hadn't previously noticed in the hex editor, would populate with a string perfectly matching the format from game.json. So with this information, I found the end of the first section of game.json, made a copy of an entry, and replaced the values with those of the Christmas tree from the cache file, and voila! I have a Christmas tree.
Simples.
I have no idea what extensions is for, by the way, but it's always 33 as far as I can tell. But anyway, this is great, and relatively easy too. Relatively easy on a small scale, that is. There was no way I was going through searching for every item and manually copying this data over. I don't even know what the names of all the items are. I can't find a complete list online, and even if I could, there's no guarantee the name in the code is the same as the name that shows up in-game. Kind of Eminem, like, lyrics was that? I cannot write code. That is simply an unfortunate fact of life. The most annoying thing is that I can look at a Python script and, for the most part, see and understand what a lot of it does in a lot of cases, but for some reason, in spite of that, I am just incapable of remembering or understanding where all the random double equal signs and such go. So with this in mind, and with an apology to everyone whose stolen code it was probably trained on, it was time to break out the AI. With ChatGPT doing the heavy lifting and some tweaks here and there from me, I eventually managed to get together a script which would take the cache file, search for the first instance of bldg_name_, the prefix for all the item names, find the nearby corresponding DID values and add them to game.json in the correct format. The only problem was the fact that the GUID values could not be directly extracted from the OBB file by the script, for some reason. After a bit more back and forth and research, I came to the conclusion that the only, or at least the easiest, way to automate getting out these GUID figures would be the Tom Scott classic.
Bodge. Bodge. Bodging. Bodge. 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 Bodge.
I actually thought this wasn't going to work at first, because the number of letters in each building name varies, so I'd have no consistent way to select the whole thing. But then I realised that you only actually need to have selected a bit of it anyway, and the GUID string shows up. Literally, all this script does is wait a few seconds, then start a loop of blindly issuing keyboard shortcuts and mouse clicks, 1,000 times over, with an escape option to shut it down if it goes wrong. But if run in the specific layout it was designed for, it would do the job.
That's alright.
If I open the OBB file in the hex editor and scrolled to the start with bldg_name_ already in the search field, opened an empty notepad file behind it, had nothing else open but the Python interpreter, and had my mouse cursor specifically on the GUID field, this would work perfectly. Literally, all this script is doing is check if I've pressed escape and stop everything if I have, Control F, enter, hold shift, right arrow 8 times, release shift, mouse click, Control A, Control C, Alt tab, Control V, enter, Alt tab, start again, with a few half-second waits between actions to account for any slight delays.
Oh, I think I might have figured it out. Sorry, hold on.
So the system is that once it's selected 8 characters beyond the initial bldg name _, I've placed the cursor over the GUID field, it clicks once, it issues Control A to select all, and Control C to copy it. Then it does Alt Tab to switch to Notepad, where it then does Control V to paste. But it doesn't just do that. Before issuing the Control V, it checks that there is something in the clipboard at all. Because after one run of the thing, it replaces the contents of the clipboard with nothing. So if there's still nothing when it does that check, it means something happened during the copy process, and it didn't actually copy. So what it then does is it loops back to click Select All, Copy. But because previously, once it had Alt-tabbed over to Notepad, Notepad was in front of this side where the GUID field was. When that happened and it looped back around to click, all that click did was click back onto Notepad, which meant that the Control A, Control C would just select all of Notepad and then copy that, which is when then everything got out of sync and everything started to fall apart. So that's how I've solved it.
I didn't realise that was the problem, but I just kind of had a hunch of maybe if I move Notepad so it's not away from, so it's not covering up the DYD field, that would work. And then it seemed to be working, I didn't realise why, and then I was shooting B-roll and it suddenly hit me when I noticed sometimes it would stay on Notepad for longer.
Oh yeah, and also when you stop the script or it finishes, it leaves you with Shift still held down, which somehow led to this being printed out. And me just writing a separate script to run afterwards to unshift because I didn't want to risk breaking the main one and couldn't figure out any better way to do it. So anyway, a few more little scripts later, I had the GUID strings in game.json in crypt format, albeit all with the same DID.
What does that mean anyway? I don't know!
Regardless, I slapped this onto my phone just to see what would happen. Clearly, I'd used the DID for the chum making machine, but hey, it's still working. The fact an item can continue to exist and fully function while attached to the wrong GUID string brings into question why items have two identifier values attached to them in the first place, but we'll press on.
I don't know very much about anything.
The DID values, as previously discussed, were trivial for a script to extract, and before long I had a fully functional DID reinsertion script. It was at this point that everything started to fall apart. Now, I was doing all this several months ago, so I don't really remember the details, but according to my folder names, it was here that I went on an entirely misguided and disastrous resident DID-based tangent, then eventually came back from that and attempted to add whatever it was I was missing here through different means. Throughout this whole process, I'd occasionally wondered where all the textures actually were, among other things, and it was only at this point that I realised something that arguably should have been blindingly obvious, and that anyone who knows anything about Android app backends has probably been shouting at the screen this whole time. The OBB file is just an archive of other files, like a zip. At first I thought this was just an interesting thing to figure out and another potential belated way to get the developer menu working. Still couldn't get it to work. But that overall it didn't really impact the project, until I realised that within the OBB was the game.json for Patchy's Town.
Yes, I'm in! Box to emoting, I've got my hands on her innards.
For the uninitiated, this was essentially a sample town supposedly made by Patchy the Pirate to demonstrate all of the various things you could get in the game. I'd assumed before that this was hosted externally or downloaded separately or something because it hadn't worked at all while messing around with the game this time, but sure enough, it was here. And if we just slap this game.json in place of my game.json...
Henmania!
Hey, Matt.
I actually tried to do this back in 2021, but presumably because I was just trying to copy bits of data out of the OBB file, I didn't get anywhere with it. There's a few things missing, but we can easily hack those back in manually. The only thing I haven't been able to get in is, weirdly, Gary. Despite obviously being an integral character to the show, and even being involved in the opening cutscene and dialogue of this very game, he, as far as I'm aware, was only added right at the absolute tail end of the game's run, potentially even being the last thing ever added, a time which this OBB file sadly seems to predate. So that sucks. As a side note, the OBB also contains all the dialogue from the seasonal events, which I can check thanks to my younger self for some reason screenshotting a whole bunch of it, but I also haven't been able to figure out how to trigger them. Although sometimes I accidentally trigger Patchy telling me Christmas was over and I didn't finish the quests, even if I tried setting my phone's date to mid-December, with the game having no other way of checking what day it was. As such, this is very much not a perfect experience, but it's a heck of a lot better than it being completely unplayable, and I think as far as I can get with my very limited knowledge of programming and generally what the heck I'm doing. Maybe someone else with a much more in-depth knowledge of how Android games work can take a look at everything so far and figure out the finer details. Now, obviously that was all Android, and as for iOS, at first here I was just going to make a joke along the lines of get an Android phone, you get what you give, and then show this.
I can't send my mom certain videos, or she can't send me certain videos, and so we leave.
Buy your mom an iPhone.
But then I realised that, first of all, that's not the philosophy I like to have in my life. That was just a bit of a joke. You should use whatever tech you like using, and not judge other people for whatever they choose to use. But more importantly, I then realised that the game was still installed on my iPhone SE, which I downloaded a bunch of old apps onto for the sake of nostalgia and last resort archival before I stopped daily driving it back in February 2021. And sure enough, it is still fully functional, presumably because this phone hasn't been online due to being both dead and not connected to the network since we've switched ISPs a few times since then. In fact, not only was the game here and fully functional, but also... So logically, I should be able to get the iOS equivalent of the OBB data out of this phone. So you know what that means? We're jailbreaking it.
Now, I've never successfully gotten that to work before. So yeah.
Even though the first gen SE got software updates to nearly 16, another benefit of this phone sitting offline for 3 years is that it's still on iOS 14.7.1. And you know what's good about iOS 14.7.1?
You're insecure, you're insecure, you're insecure, you're insecure.
I did briefly think I'd been lied to, but it turned out I just needed to enable untested iOS versions, which wasn't mildly unnerving at all. You can jailbreak later iOS versions, but if this turned out to be higher, I would have to learn a new jailbreaking method, which would take a few minutes of my time, so this was still nice. Unfortunately, something I hadn't factored in beforehand was the fact I'd need a network connection to then install Cydia and any other tweaks from there. And as I'd seen on Android, even without having the app open, connecting to the internet somehow has the potential to give the app an opportunity to kill itself. Sure, I'd made a backup of the phone beforehand, but if I had to fall back on that, the only version of iOS I'd be able to install would be 15.8.2, because that's the only version still signed by Apple for this phone, which I would then not be able to jailbreak with this method, and I'd be back to square one finding a legitimate jailbreak for that OS, which would be annoying, although not as big of an issue as I for some reason built it up to be throughout this paragraph. Regardless, I bit the bullet and connected. I installed a file manager and got to work tracking down the game files. After having no success getting them off the phone with the file manager's network transfer features or share sheet, I eventually learned what Apple File Conduit is and pulled the files via iMazing. Unlike in Android, where an app's files can be distributed between its directory in Android/data and Android/OBB, iOS employs sandboxing to keep every app contained within itself. This is generally a security feature, and here means that everything we need should be in one place. I backed up an unaltered copy of both the apps file and a .zip I'd made on the phone, and then had a bit of a browse. Comparing this to the contents of the Android OBB file, it seems to all be here, with the only exception being this bin folder. On Android, this makes up the majority of the size of the OBB, and the iOS build is slightly smaller, but that could just be down to iOS machine code being mildly more efficiently compiled than Android. Although with that said, there's evidence of the game being built in Unity, in which case the only native machine code we'd be dealing with here would be a C# interpreter. I think. I'm not 100% confident in my knowledge of how it works, but I'm pretty sure it's basically that.
Why don't you back it up with a source? My source is KC.
Regardless, the only way to be entirely sure this was all the files you'd need would be to try and get the game running using only these on another iPhone. So you know what that means. Time to pull another phone from the pile. My other SE, formerly belonging to my dad, was used and updated all the way through to the bitter end, so for simplicity's sake we'll be using this iPhone 6, originally belonging to a certain brick wall, if you know, before being sold on to a man with an Angry dad and in turn being sold on to me, where it went on to be used in a film project that never went anywhere, but mainly because I wanted a clean slate to mess around with jailbreaking the first time round. As you can see, it's in perfect working order. Employing the assistance of an HDMI dongle I had to go on a jog to get because I'd left it elsewhere.
I'm a natural jogger.
And a capture card, before realising you can achieve the same thing just over regular USB, which I'm surprised I didn't know you could do until now. I easily jailbroke iOS 12 and slapped the files into place. Unsurprisingly, this didn't work. I then tried extracting the app and its data from the first phone and then injecting it back into the second phone, all using iMazing. And while this did eventually work, even if it had to, as far as I can tell, make a backup of the second phone, inject the app into that backup, and then apply said backup back onto the phone, the iMazing extract wasn't even 1 megabyte, so clearly this isn't the complete backup of the game's data we're ideally looking for here. In fact, just to test this, I later tried disconnecting my computer from the internet mid-inject, and sure enough, it was pulling data from a server because it got stuck. I also tried a few on-device apps from Cydia to make a complete restorable backup of the app, which went well. Then I read a bunch of contradicting information about how IPA files assigned to Apple IDs and decided I'd see what I could do with that. Out of curiosity, and so I'd have a download without the cache data, I deleted the app from the iPhone 6 and re-downloaded it from my App Store purchases, only to find that it just worked? What the... Thinking that maybe when I deleted it had somehow retained some of the cache data, I even pulled back out that other SE which has never seen the game in its life, and it worked on there as well? Connected to the internet and everything. And even not connected to the internet on first startup. It's odd to say, but the fact it works with and without is confusing in two entirely separate ways. How did it work offline without being able to download the additional content, but how did it work online when surely that would make it kill itself? But clearly it doesn't always work, because when my grandparents had an unrelated attempt to play the game again on iPadOS, it didn't work for them, and I'm pretty sure they'd never had it on that particular iPad before. Unless that iPad was set up from a backup of a previous one which did have it, and some of the data was preserved, and it only kills itself on iOS if you have a pre-existing save? I have no idea what's going on here.
Except it turns out it doesn't actually hang here forever. It does eventually load. So maybe they've replaced the server code that caused it to kill itself with just nothing. It's just not there at all. But then it still seems to do it on Android. In fact, let's check that. Right, okay, yeah, this is different. It doesn't seem to be killing itself anymore. Although one strange discrepancy is that before, if you pulled down the notification center or switched apps or something, when you switched back, it would briefly have the splash screen over the town for a second before it went away. But now when you do it, it does that, but unloads everything in the background apart from the stuff on the hood, so to speak, and just gives you this, and then sometimes just leaves you with this. And then if you had the shop or the inventory open or if you were in edit mode switched out, it gets very messy very quickly. So clearly, while I've been working on this, something has changed here. Also, for some reason, with networking on, it gets slightly closer to loading Patchy Town, but still throws the error. And I've just noticed, I don't know if this is the same as on the other error, I'd have to check, but it doesn't say oops, it says ops. Along with this weird capitalization and organization of the size of the lines of text, they're taking not written very well quite literally here.
Then the second SE flooded me with calendar notifications and boot loops a few times for some reason. Right. Clearly, there's a chance that if you already have the game in your App Store purchases, simply reinstalling it is inexplicably all you need. But that doesn't help if it isn't in your purchases, and who's to say it won't kill itself at some other point later down the line, so we're not done here. Clearly, the iOS version does not separately host the cache data in the same way the Android version does, even though I'm sure it used to, because I don't know why the phrase, make sure you connect to a Wi-Fi/mobile hotspot connection to download all the cool SpongeBob content the first time you play the game, or worse to that general effect, would be in my memory if it hadn't been in the App Store description back in the day. Unless they just used the same description copy and pasted on iOS and Android without thinking, and the iOS version never had this? Comparing them in iMazing, the install I just made to the second SE is actually slightly larger than that on the first, so I guess we'll work with this one from now on. While we were at it, I decided to see if I could inject one of the Patchy Town JSONs into this iMazing extraction and then reinsert it. It did kind of work, but when I started the app up it said...
You what?!
Okay.
You've caused me considerable mental distress.
Certainly hope so.
Roll up, welcome one and all to iTunes 12.6.5.3! The last version of iTunes to support iOS apps. Yeah, you used to be able to download iOS apps on desktop and then sync them onto devices like other media. I'm simultaneously not entirely sure why this was a thing, but also not entirely sure why this was removed. If you have this version, which you can still find online, it still connects to the App Store and everything, it still entirely works. So if we get logged into this, we can download the IPA file as nature intended, and see what it comes with out of the metaphorical box. 200 megabytes. Okay... This should be alright actually. I did shortly after realise that the zip file I made of the game files from the first SE is also around 200 megabytes, and since IPA files are once again technically just zip archives in disguise...
Hey! It's him! Hey, he's in disguise!
It would make sense for all the data in here to be around that size. In fact, let's extract a copy of this. Fun fact, as you will be learning from this video, a lot of things are just secretly file archives like zips. About 4 years ago, I was trying to reinstall iTunes on Windows 7 for some reason, and in spite of the version I was trying to install definitely being compatible, as I'd already had it installed on there before, hence reinstalling, and Apple's own website still claiming compatibility, the installer was determined to only run on Windows 10. That was until I opened the exe with 7-zip and manually ran the MSI installers found within, all of which worked perfectly, proving that yes, it was indeed an entirely arbitrary limitation from a company with absolutely no stakes in whether or not you upgraded your version of Windows. Okay, great. Sure enough, the extracted IPA is actually the biggest yet, so clearly all the data is in here, and that error is some kind of corruption fallback? But not the only one, because I know from personal experience that the game has a dedicated corrupt data error that can be tripped. And that other thing that I tripped earlier, where it just hides the loading bar and title and leaves you on the game splash screen forever. We already know from those ancient YouTube tutorials that it is definitely possible to hack the iOS version in the same way as the Android version. This clearly just ain't it, Chief. That is an ancient meme. If we can get this IPA installed on any device without it having the app already in its account's library, we should hopefully just be there. Okay, we need a device on a completely unrelated account that's never heard of me before. The setup of this second SE is literally just stock default iOS 15 and means nothing to me. I have other devices set up period correct to when they were being daily driven. It's nice, I don't know. So let's just give this a reset. Right. I used to run into problems like this when I was still under 18, and my Apple ID reflected that and still treated me like a child within the iCloud family sharing system, leading to obnoxious things like not letting me turn off Find My Device, which you have to do before you can reset a device, meaning I'd have to do the stupid workaround of logging into Find My on another device and then remotely erasing the device as if it had been stolen or lost. But now I'm 19 and screen time isn't even enabled on this device. What the f*** is this? Darn it, iOS, it's stupid stuff like this that drove me away. Oh, okay. I turned screen time on, then off again, and then it just worked? Who cares, it's working, let's just move on. So with this phone now set up as an entirely separate user who has never interacted with me before in his life, we can see what we can do. Installing the IPA we got from iTunes through iMazing just throws a permission error, followed by the classic "this app is no longer shared with you," which brings back terrible memories. Some further online research suggested the use of Cydia Impactor, which, as of 2019, needs a paid developer account to work, and I can't expect everyone who wants to play this game to shell out for one of those, or AltStore. I slapped Alt Store onto the phone and started it up. No idea how I struggled with this before, but still no dice. Following the advice of good old some guy on Stack Overflow, I tried manually extracting, modifying, and reinserting iTunes metadata.plist, replacing all mentions of my accounts in it with the new account, and while my changes did show up in iTunes, I got the same error in Alt Store. What doesn't help is the fact that this phone keeps crashing and rebooting. I'm now remembering why he stopped using it. The 3 owners deep 16GB iPhone 6 with the obliterated screen and 3 versions older iOS is somehow substantially more stable and reliable to use than this thing. I then realised that since it was a Unity game, I could fairly easily try decompiling it. Absolutely no real idea what I could do with this, I figured I'd give it a go regardless. Yeah, this kind of works. This sure is a bunch of Unity files, and it sure does open as best it can, but I don't think we can do anything with this. Next up, we have Sideloadly, another program for self-signing and sideloading apps. It couldn't re-sign my IPA to a different account. It tried its best, but the game just crashes whenever you try and open it. Then I somehow ended up on another mildly sketchy site for game hacks and mods, where I found various uploads of modded versions of the game. At this point, why not? So I went through the process of making an account so I could download this IPA, tried signing and sideloading it onto the second SE with Sideloadly, and it works. Kind of. It refuses to finish loading unless you log into your account for the site I got it from, which is not a solution I'm satisfied with. Sure, we're now unconjoined and non-reliant on an Apple server, but we're still reliant on a server, and frankly, we're arguably in a worse situation because I have a lot more faith in Apple continuing to run their servers than this random game modding site, which could probably get taken down by a DMCA claim at any moment. Maybe if I can unmod this IPA somehow, we'll be left with simply an unsigned IPA of the raw and altered game? I gave it my best shot, but once again, and as usual, I basically have no idea what I'm doing. Plus, this modded IPA, which is the newest one on the site from December 2018, contains a folder called Hockey SDK Resources.bundle, where my IPA contains one called App Center Distribute Resources. The former is a deprecated old version of the latter in Microsoft Visual Studio, implying strongly that this is a mod of an older version. This is of course not helped by the Christmas-themed splash screen and snow everywhere. Just to see how functional it was, I logged into the modded version with the account I'd had to make to download it in the first place, and it did kind of work. I did get in-game, and sure did have a lot of currency and food, and was a high enough level that I was bombarded with the quests from every level all at once in reverse order like on Android, but then I couldn't do anything. It wasn't frozen, I could still move around, but Mr. Krabs was nowhere to be found, and I couldn't interact with anything. So that's great. I'd also recently learned about the existence of Troll Store from a video about Minecraft Apple TV edition, of all things. I powered up the first SE again, and the other one. I installed Troll Store, I went through the steps, and what do you know? It works.
You want to go first, or should I?
Well, why don't we go together?
Yeah, all right. 1, 2, 3.
So, with that said, if you're on iOS, even after all of that, all you need is to install Troll Store, which doesn't even require a jailbreak. You've just got to make sure you use the right method for your chosen iOS version. And you can install the game from the file provided on the Internet Archive link. So there we go. So with that in mind, I've uploaded all the stuff you might need to the Internet Archive. The OBB cache file, the game's APK, an unedited Patchytown game.json, a copy of the Patchytown game.json which I've totally bulldozed so you can design your own town from scratch, although I'd recommend putting things out in the order they're in the inventory since it takes literally minutes to scroll to the end like this, and simple text instructions explaining how to get this to work. Just make sure that you make regular backups of your game.json file if you plan on putting any kind of time and or effort into this game. On multiple occasions when I've fully closed it and turned my networking back on, it has somehow managed to ping some server in the background, causing it to lock itself up again like I've said. And I've had to move game.json out of its folder, uninstall and reinstall the app manually and put the OBB and game.json files back. But on one occasion, I've had it also totally wipe my game.json, so just be careful. So with that PSA out of the way, it's time for...
Small text, full stop at the end. Some amazing trivia.
If you manually hack in a seasonal character who would normally wish for seasonal food, but you haven't unlocked or hacked in any of their seasonal food, they will only wish for toast, which is presumably some kind of default. The maximum amount of currency you can have is 999,999,999. You can still earn more than this, but it just doesn't get added on. The maximum amount of any given food type you can have is for some reason different at 32,767. You can specify more than this in game.json, but it will always round down to this when you start the game. The game was clearly never intended for a screen as wide as my Note 9s, which means you can see what order everything is loaded in behind the loading screen, including an answer to the age-old question of my younger self of why it hangs on 66%. It's because that's when it loads in all of your buildings and characters, presumably the most processor-intensive part of the process. This is the contents of the unedited Patchy Town inventory. Patchy Town was introduced sometime in late 2014, and a little beforehand, October 5th of that year, I was playing the game as normal and noticed what I now know to be the button for it would appear for a split second when entering a production building. After several attempts, I managed to tap on it and was presented with the finished loading screen, leading me to a clearly near clean state game.json which they hadn't started work on yet beyond getting it past the tutorial. Creepypasta-ass stuff, I know. Although clearly they'd done some work on designing it because the background of the loading screen is a fully built town. Granted, not the same fully built town as Patchy Town eventually came to be, something which I noticed and was confused by even back in the day, so I'm not sure what that's about. I tragically lost my first town to what I stand by to this day being an iOS issue. My dad had just set up iCloud family sharing for us, so I no longer had to use an iCloud account, which was technically his because he was for some reason very against the concept of lying about your age on a meaningless internet account. This was overall a net positive, don't get me wrong, but did cause some kind of issue that led to me being presented with this error, which is why I made that comment on it earlier. When I asked him if he knew any solution to this, he accused this of being an issue with the game's most recent update, in spite of the fact that a day or so prior I was playing that exact same update, which had come out that day, perfectly fine with the old iCloud system, and only now said system had changed had this very obviously iCloud-based and not game-based error presented itself. I suppose the fact that I got that same error during this project somewhat proves me right, so I'll take that I suppose. In what must have been 2000 and... flipping heck, when was it? When did we switch to the iCloud system? It was definitely pre-2015. Was it 2014? It might have been 2013. That feels too long ago, but it might have been 2013. I'm sorry, I know this is what you off when you're editing, and there's just massive bits of me talking about other stuff, and I want to figure this out so I can say it. I'll have to look at my iTunes purchases. 1 second. Right, January 2015 is when I purchased the last app on my original iCloud account, so it must be early 2015. It can't be early, it must be, what the heck? It must be late 2015, because it was a Halloween update. What the heck? That makes no sense. Late 2015. Really? Late 2015? What the heck? When was my first purchase on the other? Oh, I'll close it. No, the first thing I got on that was April 2015. Must be early 2015. What? No, April. What? I genuinely, I cannot figure out what's gone on there. I don't know. When did the corrupt game data thing happen? April 2015. Right, I'm just gonna carry on. Apparently I lost my second town in April 2015. But I definitely had 2 towns in the old days. And it was definitely the corrupt game data one because I referenced it, I'm sure I did. And I didn't play it in 2016. So the iCloud thing must be the first one. Unless I only played it for like 3 minutes. I don't know how this is possible. I don't know. I don't know what's going on, I'll be honest. But anyway, as press on, I think I've got these in the right order. My second town got corrupted, and the support emails didn't do much besides repeatedly suggesting turning the time off and on set automatically, clearly in relation to the cheat which allows you to skip wait times by changing your local phone time, because the app uses local phone time, not server-based time. They also confirmed weirdly that there was just no game data on their servers under my town ID thing. So that was nice to hear. Another weirdly specific detail I remember about that ancient YouTube video that I saw was that the person recording it accidentally deleted the entirety of their game.json. They accidentally highlighted everything and then pressed backspace, and then audibly panics, but then managed to tap cancel and everything was fine. Which is also how I know that this video isn't that same one, because that doesn't happen in this. My first town randomly had a golden spatula decoration in it, and I don't know where it came from. Presumably, I was shown this message when I first started, which I found a picture of much later, but I just didn't think anything of it or pay attention to it. In fact, tied into that, because the golden spatula was in my inventory, in that same first town, I accidentally stored SpongeBob's house into the inventory before I'd even got to the collect rent from SpongeBob quest, which is very early on. I didn't know that the inventory was a thing, so I didn't know what I'd done. I didn't know where it had gone, and it took me a while to actually find it and realise, oh, that's what I did. And that's when I also presumably found the golden spatula in there.
When I decompiled the IPA, I found that there was a whole bunch of largely unused assets and things in there, which, you know, getting rid of those could probably have helped take down that enormous file size, but not to worry. So I've included all of that as well. Trying to get Plankton naturally is a weird situation, because he's not unlocked at a certain level. He's an unlock from quest, and I don't know how to trigger the quest. Not even from hacking, just from normally playing the game. And I feel like maybe it's waiting for me to finish the Patchy Town quest first, which I obviously can't do because Patchy Town won't load even with the slightly more progress it makes when you're not offline. When I first hacked in the elf apartments and saw them in my inventory, I assumed I'd assigned them to the wrong DID or GID or something, which is what caused it to look squashed like this. Turns out, I just by sheer coincidence had picked an item to hack in, which just is wrong in this sense, and it's always squashed like that as far as I can tell. Although I did have the wrong DID or GID, so it was all a big coincidence. Some of this trailer footage seemingly uses either very early version or even development beta footage of some kind, because this looks different to the final game. On this bit, there's even what looks like an early version of the wishing system, where characters wish for certain foods in a thought bubble above their head, but here they're just kind of floating by the looks of it. I assume that's what this is. I'm not 100% sure what's going on with the land expansions around Jellyfish Fields. Normally, in the base game as it exists today, you can get the ones on this side, but not on the side where the waterfront is. But Patchy Town has both of those, and I think maybe the waterfront ones were from the 2014, I think, Olympic Games style quest line, because that's where the fast food coliseum would be in your world, which I read somewhere at some point didn't appear in your inventory. It appeared straight into your world, so maybe when you unlocked it, it unlocked those 2 bits of land and cleared the weeds, and then planted it there where it is in Patchy Town. But then I saw online that some people have the land behind as well, and I'm not sure what that's about. I'm sure it's possible to hack all of this in. I don't know how, I haven't looked into it, but it's just a bit odd. The hitbox, so to speak, around Sandy's Tree Dome is absolutely absurdly far out. Surely it could be... This is a pain. Patrick used to be unlocked at like level 32, which is just really weirdly high. I even remember reading someone complaining about this in a App Store review once, but then at some point they moved him to where he is now, which is on like level 5 or something.